There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest in this episode is Matthew Groves, a passionate coder in any programming language, whether C#, JavaScript, or PHP. However, he first got his start in Quick Basic, developing for the point-of-sales system that his parents used at their pizza shop in the 90s. However, now he works at Couchbase, a popular NoSQL database company. Matthew dedicates himself to assisting fellow developers in the software community, but he also enjoys quality time with his family, watching the Cincinnati Reds, and participating in developer events. He's the author of AOP in .NET, Pro Microservices in .NET. He's a Pluralsight author, the organizer of C# Advent, and a 10-time winner of the Microsoft MVP Award. In this episode, Matt and I will have a very interesting conversation about the C# programming language and how it can make your software projects more predictably successful, as well as his C# Advent online event. Let's jump in. Hey, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jay.
Yeah, so good to see you again. So today we're talking about C#, and the theme of this podcast, we always talk about different technologies, tools, processes that help, software projects be more predictably successful. Software projects are notoriously difficult, and I think historically we've had about a 50% success rate with them, being on time and on budget. So today we're, talking about C# and probably a little bit by association .NET. And I wonder if you could give me kind of the elevator pitch. What are these things?
So C#, it's a language I've been using for around up to 20 years. And it's a strongly typed language, very similar in syntax to like C or C++. It's very tightly coupled to the .NET framework, which is a very good thing. Lots of great language features, cross-platform, big community, great tooling, continuously improving, and a lot of other stuff we'd go into. But that's, I think, the elevator pitch for why C# is so good and why it's caught on so well.
And this is what the uninitiated might refer to as C#, right?
I used to call it C# before I knew how it was pronounced.
That's right. Which also dates you a little bit, right? If you know how to call the hashtag the pound sign.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so curiosity, going back those 20 years or so that you've been working with it, what got you started first with C# and .NET?
It just kind of was a natural progression. I was working a lot with VB Script, an ASP Classic, further date myself, and we moved into .NET just because it kind of seemed like the natural way to go to keep getting Microsoft support, and started out with VB.NET, and once I started learning that, and then I'd see C# examples, and I thought, wow, this is so much better than VB. Why don't we try C# for a while? And then we did that, and that's what I've done ever since.
Nice. So way back when C# first came out, obviously that's the C# is like a reference to C or C++ there, but I think It was largely coming out as kind of a Java competitor. Did you ever dabble around in Java in those days?
Not really, no. I've my Java experience is a lot more recent, in fact, but I wasn't really aware of Java. I think the way I worked, we had some Java code, but I never really touched it. It wasn't part of my stuff my team was doing. So no, never really had that. So I came into it without understanding, I guess, that it was kind of a Java competitor, or some might say a Java knockoff.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of people who don't use a programming language start to develop certain misconceptions or like, popularly held beliefs that may or may not be true about those programming languages. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about C# as a programming language?
It's so weird to say this after 20 years and seeing where .NET is now, but I still think there's a lot of people who think it's Windows only, which
Mm.
is, to you and me who have kind of used C# for a long time, and we're MVPs and everything. That's just kind of hard to fathom. But I mean, even as recently as this year, someone has made that mistake
Mm.
and assumed that .NET was a Windows only, that I've come into contact with recently. So that's a huge one. The .NET now is fully open source, cross-platform, um, true open source, right? And Microsoft has embraced open source to an extent I never thought was really possible back in
Mm.
those ASP classic days. So
Mm-hmm.
um, it's very Microsoft dominated, but it is a true cross-platform, true open source. And of course, I'm talking about .NET here and conflating that a bit with C#, but it's kind of hard not to do. They're very
Yeah,
strongly related to each other. So
that's right. They're
um,
kind of on the
that's
same release cycle and everything.
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah.
So for somebody who doesn't, who maybe just heard you say that and that's new information, um, this is not new news either, right? Like this has been going on a while. Talk a little bit
Yeah.
about where we're at in that history.
Yeah, so I'm not like a history expert on this kind of stuff, but yeah,
Sure.
so
I won't ask you for
originally,
I won't ask you for dates.
yeah, right. So .NET and C# kind of started around the same time, roughly, and it was .NET Framework is what we call it now, which was Windows only, right? To an
Mm-hmm.
extent. I mean, there was mono and things, but it was Windows only. So you're running .NET, you're deploying to Windows servers, to IIS, to Windows desktops, and so on. And there was a kind of a very gradual transition to embrace open source by Scott Guthrie, I guess, in a sense, and the .NET team um, when ASP.NET MVC came around, which was still Windows only. But I think those efforts and kind of Windows Azure move. No, I say Windows Azure, also dating myself. Microsoft Azure kind
Yes.
of moved towards more open source and Linux, and that kind of led to, well, let's do a .NET that we can deploy to Linux, like an
Mm-hmm.
official one, and that was called .NET Core, and that kind of led to a much quicker release cycle for .NETs, and I believe we're almost to .NET. It's not called .NET Core anymore, but .NET 8, which is the natural progression, kind of a more unified version of .NET. While the .NET framework is still out there, still supported for a while, but .NET Core and sort of the new .NET 6, 7, 8, that's where most of the new efforts are in the language and in the framework.
So kind of underscoring my question, or the point behind my question, I guess, is if this is news to you, you're about 8 years behind, right? This has been going on for a while. Um,
I, you know, the I work with a lot of developers, talk to a lot of developers in my line of work, and there are a lot of assumptions and misconceptions out there, a lot, because if you're not in it every day, you kind of hear things through social media and through
right.
conferences and things, and you just kind of tuck them away as assumptions in your mind. And unless you go and research those or get challenged on those kind of stick for a long time.
Sure. And we all kind of live in a bubble in a way, right? Like if you're working on a team that's using a different technology, that's going to be the thing that you are enmeshed in every day, and that's the
Yeah,
people you're going to be surrounded with. And if there's some misconceptions, it takes a while for those to kind of to get out of to get eradicated if you're sort of in a bubble. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about C# today was because when this podcast goes live, we're going to be right in the middle of an event called C# Advent that's happening every December for the last some number of years. I want to, since you're the person kind of behind organizing that, I wonder if you could kind of give us the download on what that is and how somebody gets involved in it.
Sure. So let's start with what an advent calendar is, because not everybody's familiar with those. But
Sure.
it is it's a countdown to Christmas, and these take different forms. But traditionally, it's been like a small gift or a candy every day. You wake up in the morning, or you come home from school, and you open up the advent calendar, get a piece of candy or a toy every day to count down from December 1st until Christmas Day. So Lego advent calendars are very popular and things like that. I do a coffee advent calendar.
Hmm.
My wife did I think it was a jelly advent calendar one year. But
Oh,
so the
wow.
C Sharp advent calendar is like that, but instead of candies or toys, every day is unwrapped a piece of C Sharp content. So blog posts, live streams, videos, tutorials, whatever. And that's actually twice a day. I had to expand it after the first year. There was so much interest. So it's twice a day. So it's actually 50 pieces of content from December 1st to December 25th. And all this content is out there on each individual's. They volunteer they sign up for a day, and they put content on their, wherever they want to, on their blog, their GitHub repo, Medium, Dev2, whatever. And then when that piece of content is unwrapped, the link for that is then shown and people can go and check it out. And they link back to C Sharp Advent. So it's kind of like, again, keep dating myself, but a web ring, if you remember any of those, where people keep linking to each other, related content.
Hmm.
And so that's how it works. And the idea was I kind of ripped it off from the F Sharp Advent calendar, which was going on since 2010. And I said, this is a pretty cool idea. Do you mind if I do one for C Sharp? And he said, sure, go ahead. So I've been doing it ever since.
And I think in the years since then, there's been some other ones that have been inspired by that as well, right?
I don't know if directly inspired by me, but there's tons of other developer related advents. If you go to the C Sharp Advent website, I try to link to as many of those as I learn about. Smashing Magazine, actually, in the last couple of years, does a roundup of advents as well, and C Sharp Advents was nice, lucky enough to get listed there. So that was a very cool source of traffic as well.
That's really cool. So if someone wants to check out C Sharp Advent when this goes live, we'll be right in the middle of it. Where do they go to find it?
Yeah, go to csadvent.christmas. Yes, that's a real URL, and go there and check it out. We'll be about halfway through, and you can check out that site. I also promote it on Twitter and social media, but you can find everything starting at csadvent.christmas.
Okay. And then let's say someone wants to be part of the team that is contributing to that in the
Yeah.
future. Obviously, maybe sort of missed the boat this year by the time this comes out. How do they get involved in the future?
Yeah. So around when we're recording this, right? This is early October, late September. I open it up, 50 blank spots, and you click on a link, put your information in there, and you're signed up. Easy as that. You don't have to come up with a topic or have the content ready. You don't have to give the content to me. This is purely we're promoting your site, your brand, your content sort of thing. So it's all, I just have a collection of links, and I just have some very basic rules. And after that, as long as it's C Sharp related, go and create something great.
Hmm. Well, thanks for organizing that and for sharing about it. Hopefully, people will check that out. And I know that I'll have a blog on there, and I know a lot of other really excellent people will be posting stuff on there as well. So I'll definitely be checking those out twice a day in December. Getting back to C Sharp though a little bit.
Sure.
So I would say C Sharp is a very popular language. If you look in a lot of metro areas at job listings, I'm in Michigan, you're in Ohio. I think in both of our metro areas, I think this is probably true. If you look at job listings, C Sharp and .NET are near the top of the list of the most common ones. I think that's true a lot of places. But I think what's funny is that if you go into certain regions or certain industries, that becomes extremely not true. The most maybe famous one of those is startups are kind of notoriously anti C Sharp and .NET. What do you think that is? Where does that come from? That some of us love it and some of us completely ignore it.
So there's a lot of reasons I think that this could be the case. Certainly historical reasons. As good as I think Microsoft is doing with open source right now and their approach to community, Microsoft has a very let's just say, spotted reputation, historically speaking. And again, those things really kind of stick around for a long time. Even if leadership changes, policies changes, licenses change, people still have those things in their mind. So they maybe are maybe afraid of or hostile to Microsoft and just don't even consider it, not even an option, right? Which is unfortunate because it's some great stuff in .NET that could serve startups really well, I think. Another issue might be that there's a bit of a learning curve with C# compared to something like JavaScript or even Python. As much as I don't like Python, I have to admit it's pretty great to get started on. So C# historically has had lots of ceremony. You do a file new hello world, and it's got 10 lines of 3 different levels of indentation. So that's a lot, and maybe intimidating at first. And even the tooling around a Visual Studio, great tooling, but it's a very big install. And even there's free versions, it still takes a lot to get that up and running. That being said, Microsoft and others around tooling have made great steps to improve that situation. So things like top level statements in C# and minimal API kind of make the experience a little closer to the real easy Node and Python startup, .NET CLI tools. There's been a Visual Studio Code, of course, which is more lightweight and cross-platform IDE. JetBrains Writer is cross-platform. Another great C# development experience there. So I think Microsoft and the language team and .NET team are well aware of these issues and have taken a lot of steps to improving that situation. So, it may take a while to overcome that kind of bias and that historic learning curve, but I think C# on the right path to possibly getting better adoption from, those non kind of traditional conservative industries and the more cutting edge startups.
I heard some analysis that would suggest that startups are kind of populated with a younger generation of developer that are maybe a little closer to their college years or education years, and that a lot of places where you're learning programming, it's going to be in things like Python or JavaScript these days. Do you think that plays any kind of a role?
I think that's definitely true. Of course, I haven't been again dating myself. Haven't been in college in a long time, but we never touched anything Microsoft in the college courses I was taking. It was all, in fact, it was C++ back then, but I assume it's a lot of Java, JavaScript, Python these days. Even boot camps are very much JavaScript and Node related. So, I think there's a lot of stuff to not like about JavaScript, and I can go on about that for a while, but it is a very accessible language and very easy to get started with. And I think C# has a ways to go to catch up with that kind of, awareness and penetration and adoption that JavaScript has. And I think it could get there. It's just not there quite yet.
JavaScript has the distinct advantage of being ubiquitous, right? It's web browsers are everywhere. Thanks to Node.js, JavaScript is on the back end as well. C# historically hasn't been everywhere, and I think you could make the argument that it's getting to be more that way now. But that's definitely.
I would agree for sure. I mean, you see, C# can run a lot of different places now, back end, front end. Now, mobile, of course, embedded, multiple games engines, infrastructure as code, but it's just not quite the same level of penetration, at least not yet.
Yeah. Even inside the web browser now, thanks to things like WebAssembly, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we're talking here often about how do I make my software projects more successful, and when we talk about a programming language, the thing my mind goes to is selecting the right programming language for the right project. There are a bunch of languages out there. Even if you just look at popular ones, there's probably 20 these days, and there's some kind of specialty ones that are so let's say functional programming languages, for example, like F# or Haskell or Clojure. C# is kind of categorized, I would say, as more of like a general purpose language. So how do you think what's the right type of project for a general purpose language? How do you know that is a good choice for you in your project?
I mean, I guess I would start with what are you trying to do? What are your requirements
Mm-hmm.
of your project, and then looking into how each language kind of addresses that, right? So, there's been an ongoing debate about strong typing versus loose typing, dynamic typing, and so on. But if you're trying to build a project where you want it to be predictable, and you want it to be reliable enough, right? I think strong typing has a lot of benefits, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and something like C# has strong typing. Um, one of my complaints about JavaScript is that there basically is no standard library, right? So you have to add in hundreds, thousands of dependencies sometimes to accomplish really basic things. Whereas .NET has a very large standard library of great tools to help accelerate and can make your building of your project more predictable. And then language features. C# has, if you remember back in those days of C#1, C#2, there was no generics, there was no link, there was no lambda, there was no NuGet. It was actually pretty awful looking back at it. I think it was like a terrible Java knockoff, if I had to look back and be honest. And so I wonder any of us used it enough to get into the much better versions, starting maybe a C#3 or C#4, where we have all those features now, and
Mm-hmm.
in some ways surpass Java as a language now. Um, and things like async await make I'm not going to say threading, but parallel coding so much more easier to do. Link, which saves so much loop writing that I had to do, those first 2 or 3 years of C#.
Mm-hmm.
Interpolated strings just make stuff easier to read. So these are all language features that Microsoft and C# team keep adding to make the developer's experience a little easier, so they can spend more time on writing those more predictable, more testable, more reliable bits of code.
So let's say you kind of go down all that checklist that you just mentioned that are, I would say, the technical differences between some different platforms and languages, and asynchronous programming, and the ability to do, let's call it syntactical sugar, with things like link inside the
Sure.
programming language. You kind of check all those boxes. There are probably still a few languages that are left on your list, in addition to C# that maybe check all those boxes. Are there other reasons that you might go with one? Once they kind of all end up tied for first place like that, is there other
hmm
reasons that you might use to distinguish C# from other languages, like, for example, hiring?
Yeah, yeah. So certainly, hiring is an important thing to take into mind. These are non-technical reasons, right? Um, it if I want to use Rust, maybe there's a good reason to use Rust, but how many people are in the Rust talent pool right now?
Mm-hmm.
And this is why JavaScript is doing so well, because even as .NET developers, we know how to write JavaScript. So there's a huge talent pool there to select from. But yeah, C# .NET has a great large talent pool, large community of support to go with it. Microsoft MVPs like you, who go out to conferences and talk about things like YARP. The ecosystem of .NET, or sorry, of a NuGet packages.
Mm-hmm.
NuGet itself, tremendous package manager and dependency manager tool that I could not imagine living without anymore, even though I
Mm-hmm.
have lived those days. And I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned earlier, tooling is, Visual Studio, I think, is probably, I know I'm a little biased, but probably the gold standard for IDEs like in the world, right? Um, and it's just an embarrassment of riches, because we also have VS Code, of course, and JetBrains Writer, that are all
Mm-hmm.
excellent tools. And then ReSharper on top of that. And so all these things make it uh, an excellent developer experience, and you have a lot of developers who can fill those roles.
Yeah.
Um, So yeah, I think that those are also positive things about C Sharp.
Those are all good reasons to consider too. And I think, your existing team, right? If you've got a bunch of JavaScript developers already on your team, it doesn't make a lot of sense to use Python or C Sharp on your back end. If you've got a lot of .NET developers already and you've got a talent pool that you could use to hire more, then maybe it does. Um, so with the .NET now being cross-platform for the last 8 years or so, that we were talking about earlier, we used to call that .NET Core. Now Microsoft has rebranded that to just .NET. Um, with that, do you have any stories of some scenarios that you've seen that unlock? I'll give the first one to give you a chance to think about it. Uh, I had a client that I worked with years ago who was finding it impossible to hire developers to work on some software that they did that was embedded inside of switches. And the reason that they were having a hard time finding them is because the particular set of technologies that they were able to compile and run on a switch that basically ran on a small version of Linux was was a limited set of technologies. And they, bemoaned the fact this was many years ago. This was like 10 years ago. They bemoaned the fact that uh, that .NET didn't run on anything except Windows. And now I often think of them, uh, and I wonder back to those years and if they've sort of kept up to date or not on the fact that now they could actually hire .NET developers, compile it, and run it on an internet switch that's running Linux. Do you have any similar stories like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think my stories are mostly going to involve Couchbase. That's where I'm employed,
Yeah.
last 7+ years or whatever. And one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things we focus on at Couchbase is trying to provide familiar constructs, familiar tools to developers, so that it's one less kind of barrier
Mm-hmm.
to use something different, right? So I'll give you another example. Maybe this is a little bit more personal and a little bit less like something I encountered out as a customer, but I do some home automation stuff around the house. I'm not very good at it, but I do some home automation, and a lot of the Raspberry Picos are great for that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I have to write Python, micro Python on them, and as I alluded to earlier, I cannot stand Python, but I had to learn how to write it. Um, but on the horizon, there's something called I think the Nano framework for .NET that again kind of brings C Sharp and the familiar, the new NuGet and the C Sharp language to those devices. And C Sharp may not be the best choice for that, certainly not right now, but it's the familiar choice. And if you want to go to be productive, if you're looking at a productive point of view, not like the absolute best, perfect technical tool for this application, but something where I can take an existing pool of knowledge and apply it to a new environment.
Yeah.
I think C Sharp is definitely making some strides there.
Yeah. Sometimes the best technical choice is the one you already know, just because it saves you that time, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned your employer, Couchbase, which is a NoSQL or document database. But talk a little bit about, for those that are listening that like to do C Sharp and .NET, talk a little bit about the support that you guys provide for C Sharp and .NET developers.
Yeah, so we talked about startups and how sometimes they're a little more hostile towards C Sharp, but I think we have a pretty good story for C Sharp developers at Couchbase. So um, we certainly have a .NET SDK for interacting with Couchbase. It also provides some ASP.NET Core plugins, so like dependency injection and caching and session implementations for middleware, things like that. And there's an open source project called Link to Couchbase. So again, trying to provide the familiar. The .NET developers, C Sharp developers understand Link and understand Entity Framework and Link to SQL, those sorts of things. And so a link provider for NoSQL database is going to be very helpful for those .NET developers. And behind the scenes, it gets translated to SQL for Couchbase, which is a full-blown SQL provider. One of my favorite things about Couchbase. because I come from a history of SQL Server, back all the way back to those ASP Classic days. But full-blown SQL queries for JSON data. So again, the familiar, where it's all the stuff you remember from SQL: joins and aggregate functions, window functions, ACID transactions, CRUD operations, etc. So it made my transition very smooth, and I think that's one of my favorite things about it. So that's the kind of stuff that right now a .NET developer, C# developer could check out with Couchbase.
Cool. Yeah, I think the offerings Couchbase has there that make it very smooth, regardless of what technology stack you're using. But also with things like SQL familiarity, kind of paving that road a little bit for you to help you get into document databases if you haven't been doing it for a long time. Which, let's be honest, nobody has been doing it for a very long time, right?
I feel like it's been a long time, but of course I work for a NoSQL company. So.
That's right. That's your day to day. So last question, tough one that I always like to ask at the end of each interview. This has been a really interesting conversation about C#. What other topics or what other people do you think we should also cover on the podcast here to make sure we're covering important conversations about making projects more successful?
So I took a look at your list of episodes published so far. I don't know what you have in the hopper, but one thing that stood out to me that you haven't covered yet is security. Security from a developer's point of view. It's a very important aspect that sometimes gets overlooked, unfortunately, but it's an important part of making a project more predictably successful, because there's always security concerns constantly. Every day. It's a constant battle. And so someone who I'd recommend you talk to about this is, you may have met him before, Joe Kimmerly. He's done speaking at events and things we've been to, but he is currently a product security lead at a little mom and pop company called Salesforce. And so I think he'd have some very interesting views on software security. And he's a very long career as well. So lots of interesting stories, I'm sure.
That is a great suggestion, both for the topic and the person. And I'll have to look into this Salesforce thing that you talk about and see what that is. Well, Matt, thanks for this really interesting conversation about something that I know you and I both love, C# and .NET. And also thanks for running the C# Advent. We'll be in the middle of it when this comes out, but right now I'm really looking forward to seeing what's in it this year.
Well, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that was great. That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.